February 1942. A single rifle speaks in the dark on Bataan, and a Japanese sergeant 300 meters away gets it wrong in the most understandable way. He hears 8 rounds with no pause to work a bolt, then a high metallic ping as the clip flies clear, and he calls it in as machine gun fire. It was not a machine gun. It was a semi-automatic rifle, standard issue, in the hands of an ordinary infantryman, the only one of its kind in any army on earth that morning. The rifle had a name. So did the man who spent 17 years building it. The mistake the sergeant made was reasonable. Every army on earth that morning, including his own, fought with a rifle that demanded the same small ritual after every shot. Lift the hand from the trigger, grip the bolt, pull up, draw back, push forward, press down, chamber the next round, then return the hand and aim again. A trained man could do it in a second or two without thinking, and for 50 years, that second or two had been the unspoken rhythm of every battlefield from Manchuria to the Marne. 5 shots, then the hand moves. It was simply how war sounded. The rifle on Bataan broke that rhythm. The man behind it never lowered his hand, never reached for a bolt, never paused to reset. He simply aimed and fired, aimed and fired, the recoil itself working the action and loading the next round before his ear had finished registering the last. To a soldier raised on the old cadence, that steady, unbroken fire could mean only one thing: a weapon that loaded itself, a machine. The idea that a single rifleman could produce it was, by every standard the sergeant had been trained on, impossible. But it was not impossible. It was standing in the dark with mud on its stock, and it had a name, and the name belonged to a story that did not start in the jungle. It started on a low hill above a river in Massachusetts, on ground that had been making the weapons of the United States since before the United States was sure it would survive. To understand the rifle that fooled an army, you have to understand the place that built it, because the place came first by more than a century and a half. Long before John Garand was born, before the Civil War, before there was a continental nation to defend it all, there was a hill at Springfield where the new republic chose to keep its guns. The choice was not romantic. It was made by men who had just fought a long war with weapons they could not reliably get, and who had learned, in blood, what it meant to depend on someone else's factory. The hill was chosen for its distance from the sea. A coastal arsenal could be shelled from the water or seized in a raid. Springfield sat inland, up the Connecticut River, far enough from the ocean that no enemy fleet could threaten it, close enough to water and timber and iron that it could actually function. George Washington's officers had marked the spot during the Revolution as a place to store powder and repair arms, and what began as a wartime depot took root and stayed. The guns never left the hill. In time, the hill became the place where the country's guns were not just kept, but made. That distinction matters because making weapons and storing them are different undertakings entirely, and the second one is far harder. A storehouse needs walls and a watchman. A manufactory needs skilled hands, raw material, machines, water power, and above all a system, a way of turning iron and wood into thousands of identical objects that all work the same way every time. Springfield would spend the next century and a half learning how to do that better than anyone in the world. It would become the place where an idea that changed all of manufacturing, not just guns, was first made real. But that is later in the story. Hold on to one fact about Springfield, because everything that follows hangs from it. The armory did not belong to a man, or a family, or a company. It belonged to the government. It was federal property, built with federal money, run by men the government appointed, making weapons to the government's specification for the government's army. That ownership gave it extraordinary advantages. It could plan for decades. It could chase improvements no profit-seeking owner would tolerate. It could keep a stubborn engineer on the payroll for 17 years while he failed and failed and failed at something most experts considered unachievable. No private factory on earth would have done that. Springfield did, and the rifle on Bataan was the result. That same ownership was also the thing that would much later decide its fate in a way no battlefield ever could. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. In the 1920s and 1930s, when this story truly begins, Springfield was simply the finest arms-making institution in the country, perhaps the world, and it carried a problem that no institution anywhere had solved. The problem was the bolt. By the mid-1930s, the world's great armies had spent decades perfecting the bolt-action rifle, and they had perfected it. The German Mauser, the British Lee Enfield, the American Springfield 1903, the Japanese Arisaka. These were superb weapons, accurate, rugged, reliable, the products of 2 generations of refinement, and every one of them required the soldier's hand to leave the trigger and work the bolt after each shot. It had been that way so long that most soldiers, most officers, most governments had simply stopped imagining it could be otherwise. The bolt was not seen as a limitation. It was seen as the nature of the rifle itself. A handful of inventors disagreed. The dream of a rifle that would harness the energy of its own firing, the recoil, the expanding gas, to eject the spent cartridge and load the next one automatically had been alive since the late 1800s. Semi-automatic pistols existed. Machine guns existed. Self-loading rifles existed too, in scattered experimental forms. But none had ever been good enough, reliable enough, or cheap enough to replace the bolt action as a nation's standard infantry weapon. The gap between a clever prototype in a workshop and a rifle that could be handed to 2 million ordinary soldiers and trusted with their lives was enormous. Many had tried to cross it. All had failed. Here is the thing about that gap. Closing it was not really a question of having the idea. Everyone had the idea. It was a question of someone with the right mind, in the right place, with enough time and enough patience and enough institutional protection to grind through 1,000 small failures until the thing actually worked. The idea was cheap. The execution was almost impossibly hard. It would take one man working inside the one institution patient enough to let him, the better part of 2 decades. That man arrived at Springfield in 1919. He was not a soldier. He was not an aristocrat or a famous engineer or a man with a laboratory full of assistants. He was a quiet, self-taught machinist, born in Quebec, raised partly in the textile mills of New England, a man who had learned metal and machines not from books, but from standing at a lathe since boyhood. He spoke little. He thought in shapes and tolerances. He had already designed a light machine gun on his own initiative before the government brought him to Massachusetts, and when he came with a single conviction that would define the rest of his life. The bolt could be beaten. The rifle could be made to load itself reliably, ruggedly, well enough to put in the hands of an entire army. His name was John Garand, and almost no one believed he could do it. Before we follow him into the long ordeal that consumed the next 17 years of his life, the failures, the rival designs, the skeptical board of officers who held his fate in their hands, there is one thing worth saying plainly, because it is easy to lose in the noise of dates and machinery. The story you are watching is, at its heart, the story of one stubborn man and one patient institution, and how the meeting of the two produced something the rest of the world could not. If you find that kind of story worth telling, the forgotten engineers, the places that built things, the decisions that changed history, consider subscribing, because that is the only kind of story this channel tells. Now, back to the hill. and to the man who would spend the best years of his life trying to do the impossible. When Garand arrived in 1919, the United States was not looking for a miracle. It was looking, modestly, for someone to study the question of self-loading rifles and perhaps tinker toward an answer someday. The Great War had just ended. The Army had millions of bolt-action Springfields in storage and no urgent reason to replace them. Garand was given a workbench, a small budget, and a mandate so open it was almost an afterthought. See what you can do. Few people expected anything to come of it. He was one quiet machinist in a government armory, chasing a thing that better-funded men in better-known laboratories had chased and abandoned for 40 years. He began, and almost immediately he ran into the wall that had stopped everyone before him. A self-loading rifle is not difficult to imagine. It is brutally difficult to build. The weapon must capture a fraction of the violence of its own firing and use that energy to perform, in a fraction of a second, the whole sequence a soldier's hand performs by hand: unlock, extract, eject, cock, feed, chamber, lock, and then it must be ready to fire again the instant the trigger is pulled. It must do this thousands of times without jamming. It must do it when the rifle is filthy, when the ammunition is inconsistent, when the metal is cold, or the chamber is fouled with burned powder. And it must do it while remaining light enough for a man to carry all day and cheap enough to build by the million. Every one of those demands fought against the others. Garand's first approach used the primer, the small cap at the base of the cartridge that ignites the powder. He designed a system in which the primer was pushed back by the firing pressure, and that tiny movement worked the action. On paper, it was elegant. In practice, it tied the entire rifle to one specific type of ammunition, and when the Army changed its cartridge design, the whole system collapsed. Years of work undone by a decision made in another office. He did not complain his way out of it. He started over. This was the rhythm of his life for the better part of 2 decades. Design, build, test, fail, learn, discard, begin again. He abandoned the primer system and turned to gas, tapping a small amount of the high-pressure gas that propelled the bullet, bleeding it off through a tiny port near the muzzle, and using it to drive a piston that worked the action. This was the path that would eventually succeed, but eventually was a long way off. Each version revealed new problems. The gas port eroded, the piston fouled. Parts that worked in the shop failed in the dust and the cold. He machined his own components by hand, often inventing the tools and gauges he needed because they did not yet exist. He thought in thousandths of an inch, and the difference between a rifle that worked and one that jammed often lived in exactly that margin. And he did not work in peace. The development of the Army's next rifle was not Garand's private project. It was a competition, and it was watched over by the Ordnance Department and its board of officers, men who would decide, in the end, whether his rifle lived or died. Other designers were in the field, and one of them was formidable. John Peterson, a celebrated inventor whom some in the establishment regarded as a genius, had his own self-loading rifle, refined and polished, and backed by powerful supporters. For years, the Peterson rifle was the favorite. Garand's design was the underdog, championed by few, doubted by many. The competition turned on details that sound small and were not. Peterson's rifle required cartridges coated in a thin film of wax to function, an elegant solution in the laboratory, a logistical nightmare in the field, where wax attracted dirt and could not survive rough handling. Garand's gas system needed no such trick. There was also the matter of the cartridge itself. For a time, the Army leaned toward a smaller, lighter round, and Garand dutifully built his rifle around it. Then General Douglas MacArthur, Chief of Staff, intervened and insisted the Army keep its existing heavier cartridge, of which there were hundreds of millions in store. Once again, Garand had to redesign his rifle around a decision made far above him. Once again, he did it without protest, and this time the change worked in his favor. Through the late 1920s and into the 1930s, the testing ground out, year after year. Rifles were fired in rain and dust and freezing cold, stripped and inspected, rated round by round. Garand's design grew steadier, more reliable, simpler to manufacture. The board watched. Reputations and budgets and careers were tangled in the outcome, and the arguments were fierce, conducted in the dry language of ordnance reports that concealed a real and bitter contest over whose vision of the American rifle would win. Slowly, the underdog pulled ahead. Garand's rifle kept working when others faltered. It was rugged where they were delicate. It tolerated the abuse of field conditions that exposed the weaknesses of more elegant designs. By the early 1930s, the trials were narrowing toward his weapon, and the long, grinding accumulation of small victories was becoming something larger. A consensus that this quiet machinist had, against the odds, actually done it. In 1936, the United States Army formally adopted his rifle as its standard infantry weapon. It was designated the U.S. rifle, caliber .30 M1. The world would come to call it simply the Garand. Consider what that meant. In 1936, while the German Army, the British Army, the Japanese Army, the Soviet Army, and every other major military on the planet still issued bolt-action rifles to their infantry, the United States became the first nation in history to make a self-loading rifle the standard weapon of its ordinary foot soldier, not a special unit, not an elite experiment. The regular infantryman, the man in the line, would now carry a rifle that loaded itself. No other country would match that for years, and some would not match it before the war that was coming had already ended. 17 years. That is what it had cost him. 17 years from the day he walked into the armory to the day the Army stamped its approval on his design. 17 years of failed prototypes and abandoned systems and decisions reversed from above, of testing in the cold and starting over and being the man almost no one bet on. Most engineers never get one such span of patience in a career. Garand spent it all on a single weapon, and the institution that employed him, slow, federal, unprofitable, patient, let him spend it, because it could afford to think in decades when no private company could. But adoption in 1936 was not the same as readiness. A rifle approved on paper and proven in trials is still only a few thousand examples, hand-fitted and carefully made. Turning that into millions of identical weapons, good enough to hand to a conscript army in a world sliding toward war, was a second mountain, nearly as steep as the first, and there was almost no time left to climb it. Yet the deeper question, the one that explains the night on Bataan, the sergeant with his radio, the report of machine guns where there were none, is not how the rifle was built or adopted. It is what the rifle actually did in a man's hands that the bolt action could not. To understand why an enemy 300 meters away heard one rifleman and reported a machine gun, you have to understand exactly what happened in the half-second after the trigger was pulled. You have to look inside the weapon itself. Start with the bolt-action rifle, because that is what the enemy on Bataan had been trained against, and that is the measure of everything the Garand did differently. A soldier with a Mauser or an Arisaka fires his shot. Then his strong hand must leave the trigger entirely. It rises to the bolt handle, lifts it to unlock, pulls it fully to the rear to drag out the spent brass and throw it clear, then shoves it forward to strip a fresh round from the magazine and push it into the chamber, then turns it down to lock. Only then does the hand travel back to the trigger, and only then can the soldier reacquire his target, which has almost certainly moved. 4 distinct motions, every one of them breaking his aim, every one of them stealing time. A skilled man could run that cycle in a couple of seconds. But a couple of seconds, repeated, is the difference between life and death in a firefight. Worse, each cycle pulled the rifle off the shoulder line and the eye off the sights. The soldier had to settle, find his target again, and only then fire. The bolt did not just slow the rate of fire. It interrupted the act of aiming itself, over and over, shot after shot. Now take the same man and put a Garand in his hands. He fires. And his hand does nothing. That is the whole revolution, in a single sentence. His hand does nothing. The rifle has already done the work. In the instant the bullet passed down the barrel, a fraction of the propellant gas was bled off through a small port near the muzzle and driven against a piston beneath the barrel. That piston rammed an operating rod backward. The rod unlocked the bolt, dragged it to the rear, kicked the empty cartridge case spinning out of the receiver, cocked the hammer, and let a spring slam the bolt forward again. Stripping a fresh round from the clip, chambering it, locking it tight. All of it, the entire sequence the bolt-action soldier performed by hand, happened inside the rifle in less time than it takes to blink. The shooter never felt it as steps. He felt one firm recoil, and the weapon was ready again. The hand stayed on the trigger, the eye stayed on the sights, the rifle stayed on the shoulder. The target was never lost. The soldier simply pressed the trigger again and again and again as fast as he could aim, and each press sent an aimed round downrange. That is what the sergeant heard in the dark. Picture the arithmetic from his side of the field. He has trained his whole life on a tempo, shot, pause, the small, unmistakable rhythm of a hand working a bolt, then the next shot, bang, work, bang, work, bang. Against that tempo, the Garand's fire is something else entirely. Bang, 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 smooth and unbroken, no gap where the bolt should be, the rounds coming as fast as a man can squeeze. To an ear schooled on bolt-action cadence, that sound does not register as one infantryman shooting quickly. It registers as a crew-served weapon, a machine gun. There is no other category in his experience for fire that fast and that steady from a single position. He counts the rate, finds no place for the pause that should be there, and reaches the only conclusion his training allows. He calls it in. Automatic weapons. He is wrong, and his mistake is the most reasonable mistake on the battlefield. That is the answer to the question the opening posed. That is why a single American rifle, in the hands of one ordinary man, sounded to a trained enemy like a machine gun. Not because it was loud, not because it was magical, because it had erased the pause, the universal 50-year-old pause between aimed shots. And an enemy who had built his entire sense of combat around that pause could not believe a lone rifleman had made it disappear. But there was a second sound, smaller and stranger, and it became the most famous noise the rifle ever made. The Garand did not feed from a removable box magazine the way later rifles would. It fed from something called an en-bloc clip, a small springy steel frame that held the cartridges and was loaded into the rifle as a single unit, pressed down into the receiver from the top until it clicked into place. The bolt closed over it, and the rifle was ready. As the soldier fired, the action stripped the rounds from the clip one by one, top to bottom. The clip was not just a loading convenience. It was part of the mechanism, holding the cartridges in alignment as they fed. The number it held was 8, not 5, like most bolt actions of the day. 8 aimed rounds ready to fire as fast as the trigger could be worked, before the rifle ran dry. And when that 8th round was fired, when the last cartridge had left the clip, the empty steel frame was automatically ejected from the rifle, flung upward, and out with a distinctive high ringing note as it spun away. A metallic ping, clear enough to be heard over the noise of a fight. That ping is woven into the legend of the rifle. And here the story has to slow down and be honest, because around that small sound grew one of the most repeated claims in all of military folklore. The claim goes like this: the enemy learned to listen for the ping. They knew it meant the American's rifle was empty. 8 rounds spent, the clip gone, a few precious seconds needed to reload. And in that gap, the story says, they would rise and rush the defenseless soldier, or pick him off, knowing his rifle was dry. It is a vivid story. It is told and retold in books and films and around tables as established fact. And the truth is that historians and veterans have argued over it for decades, and it is far from settled. The skeptics make a strong case. A battlefield is not quiet. It is a wall of noise, rifles, machine guns, artillery, shouting, the concussion of shells. The idea that an enemy soldier could reliably pick one faint ping out of that chaos, identify its source among many firing men, and time a rush to it strains belief. And even if the trick sometimes worked, riflemen rarely fought alone. The man beside you still had rounds in his clip. Rushing toward one ping was a good way to be shot by the rifle next to it. Some soldiers reportedly exploited the myth in reverse, tossing an empty clip onto the ground to fake the sound and lure an enemy into the open. So the ping was real. The vulnerability it supposedly created is disputed and probably exaggerated, and it has hardened into legend less because it was decisive than because it is simply a wonderful detail. The great battle rifle of the war announcing its one moment of weakness with a bright musical note. The honest verdict is that the ping is true, the danger is doubtful, and the legend is too good to die. What is not in dispute is the thing underneath all of it. 8 rounds, aimed, fired as fast as a man could press the trigger, with no pause to work a bolt. That capability was real. It was unmatched. And in 1941, it belonged to exactly one army on Earth. The rest of the world was about to learn what it meant on the ground, in the dust and the surf and the hedgerows. They would learn it the way the sergeant on Bataan learned it. Sound first, then understanding, then a report sent back through the lines that the Americans, somehow, were all carrying machine guns. The rifle existed. The advantage was proven. Now it had to be built. Not by the 1,000, but by the 1,000,000. Faster than any weapon had ever been manufactured before, by a country that was about to be dragged into the largest war in human history. In 1936, when the rifle was adopted, the armory was making them slowly and carefully, the way a craftsman makes a fine thing. A few a day, then a few dozen. The tooling was still being worked out, the manufacturing problems still being solved one at a time. Through the late 1930s, the numbers climbed, but they climbed at the pace of peacetime, when there was no enemy at the gate and no reason to tear the process apart in the name of speed. The Army wanted the rifle in every soldier's hands eventually. Eventually was the operative word. Nobody yet knew how little time was left. December 7th, 1941, ended eventually. The attack on Pearl Harbor dragged the United States into the war it had been edging toward for 2 years, and overnight the question facing Springfield changed from how well can we make this rifle to how many can we make, how fast, starting now. The answer the Armory gave over the next 4 years is one of the quiet epics of the war, and it happened not on any battlefield, but on the same hill above the Connecticut River where the story began. The transformation was total. The Armory that had measured its output in the dozens now had to measure it in the thousands per day. Buildings filled with machine tools, row upon row of them, lathes and mills and broaches and grinders, each one cutting a single component to a tolerance measured in thousandths of an inch, each component identical to the 10,000 that came before it and the 10,000 that would come after. The principal Springfield had spent a century perfecting, interchangeable parts made by machine to a fixed gauge so that any piece would fit any rifle, was now the only thing that made the impossible possible. No army could be armed by craftsmen fitting parts by hand. It could only be armed by a system in which a part made on Tuesday by one machine would drop into a rifle assembled on Friday by another, with no filing, no fitting, no adjustment at all. The workforce exploded. Before the war, the armory employed a few thousand. At the peak, it employed roughly 14,000 people, working in shifts around the clock, 3 turns a day, so that the machines never stopped and the lights in the great shops never went dark. The hill ran day and night. The noise was constant and enormous. The shriek of cutting steel, the thud of presses, the rumble of the powerhouse, a sound that rolled down over the city of Springfield and meant, to everyone who heard it, that the war was being supplied. Here is the part that is easy to skip past in the numbers, and shouldn't be. A great many of those 14,000 workers were women. The men who had stood at the armory's machines were being drafted, shipped out, sent to carry the very rifles they had once built. The benches they left did not stay empty. Women took them. Women who had never operated a lathe, never read a micrometer, never cut metal to a gauge, and who learned to do all of it, and did it well enough that the rifles they made passed the same proof tests and the same inspections as any made before the war. Consider what that meant in a single life. A woman who a year earlier might have had no place in an industrial trade now stood a full shift at a milling machine, carrying saw, nolin saw, and melons, cutting receivers for the rifle her brother or her husband was carrying across the Pacific, holding a tolerance of a few thousandths of an inch hour after hour, because a part that drifted out of spec was a rifle that might jam, and a rifle that jammed was a man who might die. The work was precise, it was relentless, and it was personal in a way no peacetime job had ever been. The pace was punishing. 3 shifts meant the work never stopped, and neither really did the pressure. Quotas rose. The front always needed more. Every rifle that left the hill was a rifle that did not yet exist that morning, and somewhere a soldier was waiting for it. The workers knew it. The urgency was not abstract. It was the reason the lights stayed on, and the output matched the effort. Over the course of the war, Springfield Armory produced millions of M1 rifles, but even Springfield, running flat out around the clock, could not make enough alone, and so the manufacturing knowledge that had been built up on the hill was shared outward. The Winchester Repeating Arms Company was brought in under license to produce the Garand as well, taking the armory's designs and tooling principles and standing up its own production line, so that 2 great factories were turning out the same rifle, interchangeable down to the smallest part. By the end of the war, the total number of M1 rifles built had climbed past 4 million. 4 million self-loading rifles, in a world that a decade earlier had told John Garand the thing could not be done at scale at all. Let that number rest for a moment against where it started. One quiet machinist at a workbench in 1919, chasing a thing the experts had abandoned. 4 million rifles by 1945, pouring off production lines on 2 sites, arming an entire nation's infantry and many of its allies' best units besides. The distance between those 2 facts is the distance between an idea and a war won, and almost all of it was covered on a single hill in Massachusetts, by an institution patient enough to fund the idea for 17 years and then disciplined enough to manufacture it by the million in 4. This was the thing that separated Springfield from every armory that had come before it, including the doomed sister armory to the south, whose story is its own dark chapter. Springfield had married 2 things that rarely live together. It had the patience to nurture a lone inventor through 2 decades of failure, and it had the industrial discipline to turn his finished design into a flood of identical weapons under the pressure of total war. The first quality made the rifle exist. The second put it into the hands of the men who would carry it onto the beaches and the islands and into the forests of Europe. Because that, finally, is where the rifle was going. Every receiver cut by a woman on the night shift, every barrel bored and gauged and proofed, every clip and spring and operating rod was bound for the same destination. A soldier, somewhere, in a fight. The 4 million were not statistics to the men who received them. They were the difference between working a bolt under fire and not having to. The armory had done its part. It had taken Garand's impossible rifle and made it real, and then made it ordinary, the standard weapon of the standard soldier, by the million. Now the rifle had to prove, in the worst conditions men can create for one another, that everything claimed for it on the testing range was true. It had to prove it in the surf and the sand and the freezing mud against the finest bolt-action rifles other nations had ever made. The sergeant on Bataan had heard the first hint of what was coming. The rest of the world was about to hear the whole of it. The Pacific is where the rifle first showed the world what it could do, and the Pacific was the cruelest possible place to ask it. Heat that warped men and metal alike, rain that fell in sheets for days, coral sand fine as flour, working into every seam and joint, mud that swallowed boots to the knee, salt air that rusted steel overnight. If a self-loading rifle, with its gas port and its operating rod and its dozens of moving parts was going to fail anywhere, it would fail here, in conditions that made even the simple bolt action a chore to keep running. Go back now to the sergeant on Bataan, because we can finally stand where he stood and understand the whole of it. In those first desperate months of 1942, American and Filipino troops on the Bataan Peninsula were fighting a losing battle against a determined Japanese advance, short of food, short of medicine, short of everything except resolve. They were not short of the M1, and when the Japanese infantry came on, trained and confident, carrying their bolt-action Arisaka rifles, they ran into a volume of aimed fire that did not match anything in their experience. A single American position could put out rounds at a rate that, by every calculation the enemy had been taught, required a machine gun crew. The sergeant who radioed that the enemy had automatic weapons was not a fool. He was a competent soldier drawing the only logical conclusion from the evidence of his ears. He simply did not yet know that the evidence had changed. Set the 2 rifles side by side in that jungle and the gap is stark. The Japanese Arisaka Type 99 was a good rifle, strong, accurate, built around a powerful cartridge, the equal of any bolt action in the world. But it was a bolt action. 5 rounds, and a hand that had to leave the trigger and work the bolt after every shot, the eye coming off the target each time. The American with his Garand had 8 rounds and never moved his hand at all. In a sudden close engagement, where the fight was decided in seconds by who could put more aimed rounds into the other side fastest, that difference was not academic. It was decisive. 2 riflemen of equal skill, 1 Japanese and 1 American, facing each other across a clearing. And in the time the Arisaka fired 3 aimed shots, the Garand fired 8. The arithmetic of the firefight had been rewritten, and the men on the receiving end felt it before they understood it. But the jungle tested more than rate of fire. It tested whether the rifle would run at all in filth. And this is where the M1's weaknesses lived, the honest ones, the ones that mattered to a man whose life depended on the next round chambering. The gas system that gave the rifle its speed was also a path for dirt. On the islands, where fine coral sand and grit got into everything, the action could foul. Men learned to keep the rifle covered when they could, to clean it obsessively, to guard the muzzle and the receiver from the sand that wanted in. The weapon was rugged, more tolerant of abuse than its complexity suggested, but it was not indifferent to the filth the way a simpler mechanism might have been. A soldier in a wet foxhole on a coral island spent a great deal of his time keeping his rifle alive because he knew exactly what it would cost him if it died at the wrong moment. There was a second problem, smaller in the telling and large in a firefight, and it grew directly out of that famous 8-round clip. The Garand was designed to be loaded with a full clip of 8. It did not lend itself to topping off. A bolt-action soldier with 3 rounds left and a lull in the fighting could thumb a few loose cartridges into his magazine and bring it back to full. The Garand soldier could not do that easily. To reload before the clip was empty meant a small, awkward procedure. Locking the bolt back, ejecting the partial clip, often spilling live rounds in the process, then seating a fresh one. In the chaos of combat, most men simply did not. They fired the clip dry, took the ping, and reloaded clean. It meant that a soldier who fired 4 rounds, then faced a sudden assault, often went into it with a half-empty rifle rather than fumble a partial reload under fire. It was a real limitation. Men worked around it by habit and discipline, firing in disciplined bursts and reloading in the gaps, but the rifle imposed its own rhythm on them, and they learned to live inside it. And here is the honest balance of it. The Garand was not a perfect rifle. It was heavy, better than 9.5 pounds, a real weight on a long march through jungle or up a volcanic slope, and a soldier felt every ounce by the end of a day. It was fussy about sand. It punished a man who wanted to top off his ammunition. The clip system that gave it 8 fast rounds also gave it that inflexible reload and that telltale ping. These were not small things to the men who carried it. A rifle is judged by the soldier holding it in the worst moment of his life, and in that judgment, the M1's faults were known, named, and cursed. But weigh them against what the rifle gave in return, and the verdict the soldiers themselves reached comes through clearly. They kept the weight. They fought the sand. They learned the reload. Because in exchange, when the enemy rose out of the brush at 30 meters, the man with the Garand could put 8 aimed rounds into the assault in the time his grandfather's rifle would have managed 3, without ever breaking his sight picture. In the close, fast, lethal arithmetic of an infantry fight that traded weight for lives, and the men carrying it knew which side of that trade they were on. They complained about the heft and the grit and the awkward reload the way soldiers always complain about the gear that is keeping them alive. They would not have swapped it for any bolt action on earth. The Pacific proved the rifle in the hardest school there was. It ran in the mud and the surf and the coral dust, often enough and reliably enough. And where it ran, it gave the American infantryman an edge no other army's foot soldier possessed. The legend that began with a confused radio report on Bataan was becoming, island by island, simple fact. The men who faced the M1 learned to respect a volume of fire that should not have come from single rifles, and the men who carried it learned that the thing John Garand had spent 17 years building would hold up when their lives were the stakes. The Pacific was the proving ground, but the rifle's reputation and the verdict of the general whose name would be welded to it forever would be sealed on the other side of the world, in the hedgerows and forests and frozen fields of Europe, against the rifle that had set the standard for half a century, the German Mauser. That is where the M1 earned the words that follow a weapon into history. Europe was a different war, fought over different ground, against a different rifle. The Wehrmacht carried the Karabiner 98K, the Mauser, the weapon that had defined what a military rifle should be for half a century. Precise, beautifully made, brutally reliable. Chambered for a hard-hitting cartridge, it was in many ways the finest bolt-action rifle ever issued to an army. German marksmanship training was built around it, and a German rifleman with a 98K was a genuinely dangerous man at long range, capable of cool, deliberate, accurate fire. But it was a bolt action, and the same iron arithmetic that had undone the Arisaka in the jungle followed the Mauser into the hedgerows of Normandy. 5 rounds. A hand that left the trigger after every shot, an eye that came off the sights to work the bolt. The German rifle could reach out and kill at distance with great precision, and in the hands of a trained marksman, in a prepared position, it was lethal. Yet most infantry fighting in Europe was not the long, deliberate duel the Mauser was built for. It was close, fast, and violent. Fights in the broken country of the Norman hedgerows, in the rubble of towns, in the dark pine forests, at ranges where the contest was decided by who could deliver more aimed fire in the first few seconds. And in that contest, the German soldier was outgunned by the ordinary American rifleman in a way he had never been before. Picture a German squad and an American squad meeting in a sunken Norman lane, hedgerows pressing close on either side, the range a matter of yards. The Germans bring their bolt actions up, superb rifles in trained hands, and begin to fire and work the bolt, fire and work the bolt. The Americans bring up their Garands and simply fire, and fire, and fire. The weight of returning rounds is not close. A German squad's volume of rifle fire, man for man, could not match an American squad's, because every American trigger pull sent a round, and every German one sent a round, followed by a pause. Multiply that across a squad, a platoon, a company, and the difference compounded into something the Wehrmacht felt across every front it shared with American infantry. The Germans had built their doctrine around the machine gun as the squad's source of firepower, with the rifleman in support. The Americans had put a small, fast-firing weapon in every single man's hands, and it changed the texture of the fight. It was this, the cumulative verdict of 1,000 such encounters that produced the words the rifle would carry forever. General George S. Patton, who commanded American armies across France and into Germany, and who was not a man given to soft sentiment about equipment, called the M1 Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised. 8 words. From a soldier of his reputation, about the rifle his men carried, they became the rifle's epitaph and its crown at once. The phrase has followed the Garand through every history written since, and it carried the weight it did precisely because of who said it and what he had watched it do. But a rifle is not praised by generals. In the moment, a man is carrying it through freezing mud. It is cursed and trusted and cursed again, and the Garand earned all 3 in Europe as surely as it had in the Pacific. Take the winter. In the Ardennes, in the brutal cold of late 1944, men fought in snow and freezing rain, and the same conditions that froze a rifleman's hands worked at his weapon. The Garand ran in the cold better than many feared, but nothing ran perfectly in that winter, and a man learned to keep his rifle as dry and as functional as the conditions allowed, because a frozen action was a death sentence in a German counterattack. The weight that had been a burden in the Pacific was a burden in Europe too. A soldier on a long march through France or across the German frontier carried better than 9.5 pounds of rifle on top of everything else, and at the end of a 20-mile day he felt every pound of it in his shoulders and his back. And the old problem of the reload followed the rifle to Europe as well. In the hedgerow fighting, where an enemy might appear at any second and disappear as fast, the inability to easily top off a partial clip meant a man had to think about his 8 rounds the way a poker player thinks about his chips, fire them too freely, and you were caught empty at the worst moment, the clip pinging away just as a German rose from cover 10 yards off, Hoard them, and you lost the very volume of fire advantage that made the rifle worth carrying. Men learned the discipline of it, learned to fire in controlled groups, to reload in the lulls, to be aware always of how many rounds remained before that bright metallic note announced an empty rifle. It was a skill, and like all combat skills, it was learned fastest by the men who survived their first few fights. The faults were real. The weight, the fussiness and filth, the awkward partial reload, the ping that told a listening enemy the rifle was dry. The men who carried the Garand knew every one of these intimately because they trusted their lives to the thing daily, and a soldier knows the flaws of what he trusts. They knew, too, that no rifle is perfect, that every design is a set of compromises, and that the question is never whether a weapon has weaknesses, but whether its strengths are worth them. For the Garand, across 2 theaters and against the 2 best bolt-action rifles in the world, the answer the soldiers gave was the same. The strengths were worth it. The weight was worth the firepower. The fussiness was worth the speed. The awkward reload and the telltale ping were the price of 8 fast-aimed rounds. And that price the infantrymen paid willingly, because when the fighting came close and quick, the rifle gave him an edge measured in the only currency that mattered, which was who was still standing when the shooting stopped. The rifle had been proven. It had armed a nation, sealed its reputation in 2 theaters, and earned the praise of one of history's most demanding soldiers. And the man who had spent 17 years building it, the quiet Canadian machinist on the hill in Massachusetts, was still there, still at his bench, still drawing a government salary. What he had given the world, and what the world gave him in return, is the last and strangest part of the story. Here is the thing about John Garand. By the end of the war, his rifle was in the hands of millions of men. It had armed the United States Army and Marine Corps through every theater of the largest conflict in history. It had earned the praise of generals and the trust of the infantry. 4 million had been built and more were coming. By any measure the world uses to keep score, the man who designed it should have been rich. He was not. He was never going to be. Understand how Garand worked, because it explains everything that follows. He was a government employee, a salaried civilian engineer at a federal armory, drawing the same kind of paycheck a skilled government man drew, year in and year out, through the whole long ordeal of the rifle's development and all the triumph that came after. He did not own his design the way a private inventor owns a patent he can license to the highest bidder. He had developed the rifle on government time, with government resources, for the government's army, and the patents on the M1, on the work that consumed 17 years of his life, he assigned to the United States. He gave them to the people, for free. Let that sink in. The single most important small arm of the Second World War, a weapon produced in the millions and carried by the soldiers of the most powerful nation on earth, generated for its inventor not 1 cent in royalties. Had Garand held those patents privately, had he licensed the M1 the way commercial gun designers license their work, the arithmetic is staggering. A modest royalty on 4 million rifles, on the tooling, on the decades of production that followed, would have made him one of the wealthiest inventors in American history, a fortune to rival anyone who ever drew a weapon on paper. Instead, he drew his salary, and the rifle that bore his name made fortunes for the nation and nothing for the man. There were people who thought this was wrong and who tried to fix it. The injustice was plain enough that more than once efforts were made in Congress to grant Garand a special cash award, a single payment, a national thank you, a sum to recognize that this quiet machinist had handed his country a war-winning weapon and asked for nothing. A figure of $100,000 was discussed, a meaningful sum in those years, though a pittance against what his work was worth. The bills were introduced, they were debated, and they never passed. Objections were raised, the way objections always are. Some argued he had simply done his job, that he was paid to design rifles and had designed one, that a government employee should not be specially rewarded for the work he was already employed to do. The proposals stalled and stalled again, and in the end, nothing came of them. The man who gave the United States the Garand was never given anything in return beyond the wage he had always drawn and a nation's vague, belated gratitude. Set this against the other side of the gun business, and the contrast turns sharp. Across the same decades, private arms designers and the companies that held their patents grew wealthy on military and commercial contracts, on royalties and licensing, and the ordinary machinery of a man owning what he invents. That is not a crime. It is how the system is built to work. But it throws Garand's case into hard relief. The designer of the most consequential rifle of the war stood almost alone among the great gunmen of his century in taking essentially nothing from his masterwork, not because he was cheated by some villain, but because of the kind of man he was, and the kind of institution he served. He worked for the government. He believed the work belonged to the country. He gave it away, and he did not complain about the giving. John Garand stayed at Springfield for years after the war, kept working, kept refining, an unassuming presence on the Hill where he had spent his entire career. He retired in the 1950s. He died in 1974. He left no fortune built on the rifle because there was no fortune to build. He left the rifle itself, which is a different kind of inheritance and one that does not show up in any estate. What became of the weapon outlived the man only a little. The Garand's reign as America's rifle was long but not endless. In the search for something with a detachable magazine and the ability to fire fully automatic, the Army adapted the M1's basic design into the M14, its direct descendant, which carried the bloodline forward into the early 1960s, and then the whole world of the infantry rifle turned again. The lightweight, small-caliber, fully automatic M16 arrived, and the era of the big, heavy, 8-round battle rifle drew to a close. The thing that had made the Garand revolutionary in 1936 had become, by the late 1960s, the old way, displaced in its turn by a new idea the way it had once displaced the bolt. But go back, one last time, to a jungle in the dark. To a Japanese sergeant on Bataan with a radio in his hand, counting shots that came too fast, hearing a bright metallic ring as a clip spun away into the night, and reporting to his commander that every American carried a machine gun. He was wrong about the machine gun. He was right about everything that mattered. He had heard something genuinely new in the world, the sound of a single-foot soldier with more firepower than any single-foot soldier had ever carried, the sound of an idea that one stubborn man had chased for 17 years and finally caught. The enemy mistook it for a machine gun because there was no other category for it yet. There would be, soon enough. But on that night, in that dark, the sound of John Garand's rifle was the sound of the future arriving 8 rounds at a time, announcing itself with a ping.